One other quick announcement before we jump into it. We are going to be decorating for Christmas in here this coming Wednesday at 9 a.m. So if you're not doing anything, we'd love to have you to help with that on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday at 9 a.m. Alrighty, with that said, it's hard to believe that we are just wrapping up this series on the Sermon on the Mount, that we've been in this series since the end of the summer for 12 weeks, slowly looking at these words of Jesus. And if you haven't been with us, this series has really started off coming from Jesus has called his disciples and he's gathered them around, and some people already have started to know the miracles that Jesus is doing. So they're starting to circle around him to hear what he has to say. And Jesus speaks some simple things to his disciples and anyone within earshot about what's the best way to live. What are some different things that they should be doing in their lives that they may not currently be doing? To give you a quick recap of this as we conclude this message, because I think we fully need to know where we're going through because of what Jesus says next in it. So the first week we talked about this idea of giving to the needy, right? Jesus says, give to the needy, and how it shouldn't be about showing all the people about the good things that we're doing. We're not explaining loudly, oh, these are the ways I'm giving. Look at how good I am, right? It's not about that. It's giving to the needy. Jesus taught us how to pray and the way that we should pray and the way that we should be looking for God's kingdom here on earth. We're not praying for our own kingdom, but God's kingdom. He taught about not storing up treasures on earth, right, where moth and rust destroy. Jesus taught that storing things in heaven and having our actions be that which store things up for the next life in heaven. We cannot serve both God and money, right? There's only one master. Jesus taught them not to worry, right? And we all know what that looks like, worry and anxiety. And Jesus said, don't worry, because of course God will care for you. Look at the birds of the field. If he cares for those, of course he would care for you. He taught not to judge people around you. Do not judge. Look at your own lives. Look at the things that you're doing. He taught to ask, seek, and knock because he will answer. Or maybe not the door that we want opened, or maybe not in the way we anticipate him to, but he is listening and he is there. He taught about the narrow and wide gates and how the path that is wide would lead to destruction, but only the path that is narrow would lead to everlasting life. He taught to watch out for true and false prophets and true and false disciples even, and how they may be very similar and the words they use may be very similar, but to look for the actions of these people to justify it. See, Jesus gives us so much information over these two chapters in Matthew 6 and in Matthew 7. To take a step out of that a minute, 5 or 6 years ago, I had started getting into running triathlons. Right? Anyone do triathlons before? Right? It's one of those things where it's like, hey, you start running, and then while you're in misery, let's add 2 more things into it that you also hate. Right? So that's what triathlon is: the running, biking, and swimming. And I started getting into that because I realized it was probably the one uncoordinated sport I could compete in. Right? It's like you don't have to be coordinated to do a triathlon. So I started getting into it. I did 2 or 3 in a summer, and I realized that I could be really good at this. Like I could. I was competitive in it, and I bet, oh man, if I worked hard at this, I think I could really place or be competitive in triathlon. So over the course of that fall and summer, that fall and winter, like my parents for Christmas got me one of those like stationary bikes where you hook up your back wheel to it so you can bike all winter long, right? Anyone grow up like in the 90s? My dad had one of those like 3-wheel contraptions where if you got off course and your bike is you could literally die if you got off it. Anyone know what I'm talking about? No, just me. That's okay. One person. Perfect. Thanks, Pat. So over the course of the winter, like I got that, and I got my bike all set up for that. Jillian got me a bunch of Christmas stuff, like so I could run out in the cold, like in the 0 degrees. I had these really nice mittens and hat and like the reflective jacket. Like I was all prepared. Like I put them all in the places that I knew I would use them. And this was the time before we had kids. So it's like, oh man, I've got this time. Like now is the time to really get into this and be successful in this. I also bought a nice new road bike that year because if I'm going to do it, I want to do it well, right? So I finally had all that stuff set up, all in its perfect spot. And you know what happened that winter? They all accumulated dust. Right? They all didn't move. They all had their nice little spots, and I didn't actually touch any of them. I didn't use them. I got busy. Things came up in our lives. And that following summer, I signed up for certain triathlons because I knew, well, I've got all of this stuff, right? Of course, I should be better. And I started competing again. I did 2 or 3 more that summer. And shockingly, I didn't get any better. How dare it, right? Like I've got all of the right stuff, and yet I wasn't getting any better. I was actually maybe my times were even getting a little bit worse as I got older. But you're all thinking, well, of course you didn't, right? Like you fool, you had all the things, but you didn't actually utilize them in the way you were supposed to. You put them all into place in their nice locations, but they just gathered dust. You didn't do anything with them that would make you any better over the course of the winter. And that, I think, is where we're at in this moment of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus has given all of this useful information. He's got it all in particular spots for the disciples and the people around. And we're at this pivotal moment of, okay, now what? And that's what jumps us into our message today. Matthew 7, we're going to be starting in verse 24 to 25, or 24 to 29. First word says, therefore. Anytime the Bible starts with the word therefore, it is signifying anything that has happened before that part. So like the Sermon on the Mount, I'd argue, is what Jesus is speaking in this moment. Therefore, so all of this stuff that Jesus has said in the Sermon on the Mount is the therefore. Okay, so now that we know all these things, do this, is what Jesus is saying. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall, because it had the foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a giant crash. Verse 28, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teachings because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. So this is crucial here. Jesus has explained and has pretty much given these blueprints about how the best way to live is and what their lives should look like. But the challenge at the end is really clear. Like, if you've got them, what are you going to do with them? All of Jesus' words are useless unless they start putting it into practice, unless they start doing something about it. So let's take a closer look at the story. And before we do that, I want to make a note of these types of houses, okay? When Jesus talks about these houses, we don't notice any differences in the houses, right? We don't notice that they've been built any differently on the outside, right? They've got similar siding. Maybe they're both 2-story houses. Maybe they both have a deck on the back, right? The point of that is they're very similar houses. They're not built differently in that aspect. Their likeness is very similar. So it isn't about the houses. Right? And if the houses, we realize that points into our lives, it shows us that, okay, the lives is not specifically how it's built, but let's look at the foundation that is under it and why that matters in this. So the rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew against the house. The rains, the wind. We know that, right? The rains and the wind beat against our lives. There's moments that come across, circumstances that happen in our lives that are difficult. Anyone else love watching a storm roll in? Like, I love going out on the deck and just looking towards the west and seeing those really dark, billowing clouds, knowing that, oh man, we're gonna get some rain. Like, I think it is just beautiful watching a storm roll in. But you also know that there's a lot of power in a storm, right? If you've watched tornadoes happen or any type of big storm, you can see the immense power that is in those storms. And even though we may enjoy good storms, I think I enjoy them because I'm standing on my deck, which I can easily get into my house, right? And I know the integrity of our house. I actually watched it get built. So I know it was built with good materials, and I know its foundation. I know that it has met the building inspector's request at Holland Township. And you know that's difficult, right? Right? Like, and I know that they have got the cement all figured out so that it is a firm foundation, that it is not going anywhere. Especially with our storms here in Michigan, that house will be firm in location there. But if we're honest, we know that it's a matter of time before storms come. Right? If we think about our own lives, it's not a matter of if the storm comes or if this flood comes, it's a matter of when. Especially when we think about what is going on in our own lives. The winds and the rains are completely out of our control. Circumstances in our lives like that, we often don't get to say when they come or when they don't come. Here's some examples of some storms. Maybe you get into work one day and you have an email that says, head down to HR when you get a chance. Right? And you know those are never good. And you get there and they explain to you that the company has to make some cuts and your job is going to be eliminated. And all of a sudden, the job that you count on financially, the insurance that you count on is now gone. That stability that you've had for years and years is gone. See, maybe you've gotten test results that you've been waiting for months for, and they are not the results that you wanted or not the results that you've prayed for. They're results that are going to drastically change your life and the way your family lives life. Maybe you have a relationship with a family member that's taken a turn for the worse, one that you used to really enjoy being with, but now that is all you can think about is that relationship and how you've hurt each other and how it is going to be different at Christmas or Thanksgiving because of that. These are storms, right? And these storms and these winds, these moments in our lives affect us, right? And they affect how we live. They change the way we live our lives. And of course, because of those moments, there's things that create worry, right? We worry about these things. It creates anxiety. It steals our attention from places our attention should be because they are big deals, right? Moments like this in our lives are big deals. And I don't want to minimize these storms in our life because they are real. Let me read these words again for you. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. So Jesus explains in this, and what we can read between the lines in here, is that we're not building houses to get rid of the circumstances, right? The rain will still come, the wind will still come, but we're preparing to withstand those things. What Jesus exactly says here, he references a rock, that we're supposed to build our foundation on a rock. But what I find interesting is where else rock comes up in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. If you start dissecting this a little bit, there's a few verses that stand out to me that I want to share with you. First one out of Psalm 18, verse 2 says this: "The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." If you were with us over the summer, these are most likely the words of David. Right? We know the life of David, and we know his life wasn't just easy all the time. There were hard circumstances. There were storms in his life, and yet he still knew what his rock was. Another one out of 1 Samuel 2, verse 2, "There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God." Psalm 62, verse 2, truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. So Jesus is telling us in here that our lives should be built on the rock. And when he is speaking to his disciples and these people that are gathered around him, when they hear rock, they would also associate it with the words of David and the words of the prophets in the Old Testament saying who their rock was or what their rock was. See, our lives should be built on God, on our relationship with God and the things that he offers. Which brings us to what happens when it is not built on God or when it's not built on the rock. Verse 26 says this, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. You can hear in that it's all the same language. Nothing different happens to the house than the first house. But it fell with a giant crash. See, now these two houses can be built exactly the same and look exactly the same on the outside, but one of those houses would be built with the foundation that it needs. The house we just referenced here, the house that's built on the sand, on the dirt, when you look at it, you can't see the foundation right away, right? If you drove past two houses, we can't see what is underneath the house very quickly. But when we walk around, if we're just walking around outside, especially after the rain, your footing is a little bit looser, right? The dirt moves around a little bit more. And we realize really quickly that what once could be firm foundation, right? If you're on clay, this stuff is rock hard during the summer. But all of a sudden with some water and the right elements, all of a sudden that starts to shift a little bit. That starts to move. And that was what I think Jesus is pointing us to here, that they could look very similar on the outsides. But we need to be watching about the foundations that both of these houses sit on. What appears to be solid may not be. There's a lot of things that I'd argue in my life, even before reading this, that appear to be solid, right? And I think we all put things in our lives that we want to be solid, that we've even put bubble wrap around them to keep them solid, right? Some of those things could be your job, right? Maybe the solid thing in your life is your family. Maybe it's your finances, your health. You've crafted perfect pieces together that it's like you can rely on those things. Those are solid in your life, but yet they're not, right? All of those things that I just named are very changeable, right? Your job can change. You can be laid off, right? Your family changes. Your parents get older, your kids get older, they go off to college, they move out. People have their own priorities all of a sudden. How dare they have different priorities than you, right? Like families change, it gets different. Your finances could be good one day and awful the next, right? We're not in control of the stock market. We don't know what retirement is going to look like. Your health changes day by day. Every day we get older, and I'm realizing that as I get out of bed, I'm like, did I lay on something wrong? What is my arm doing today, right? Like we get older day after day. And yet, when we think about the things in our lives that we feel like are stable, we feel like we've created this steadiness in some things in our lives, they're really actually not. Right? Those things in our lives don't actually hold up all the time. None of these things stay the same. And often what it is when we put our trust and hope in some of those things, it isn't going to work out. Right? If we are putting our trust in something that is changing, of course we're going to have issues. Right? Of course, when the building shifts because the foundation shifts, of course there's going to be worry and anxiety. And of course it's going to be a big deal. And it is not shocking when you look at our world and see how high anxiety is amongst everyone around us. Yeah. Of course there is, because look at where our world is placing its trust and placing its foundation in. We've stopped putting our foundation on something that is worthy of putting our foundation on. One thing that we need to know as we look at this teaching is the character of God. And I think this is most important, is that He does not change. The character of God does not change. He was, He is, and He will be. That is the beauty of our faith, is that when we put our foundation in this rock that it's talking about, when we put our foundation in God, that is so immovable. It is not going anywhere. We can trust that that foundation isn't going to sway under weight like things in our culture does. God does not change. As we wrap up these teachings, and this one specifically today, I want to give you a final challenge. Because these words that we've read over the course of the last 12 weeks, Matthew 6 and 7, if you've got a red letter Bible, which means red letters are when Jesus speaks, and the Bible focuses on that. These are all Jesus' words that are coming through in these red letter Bibles in Matthew 6 and 7. And they are wonderful words, right? They're incredibly useful. And as I think about each section that we slowly went through and have gone through over the last 2 months, I think about my life, and I think how good life could be. Right? How good life could be if we followed the blueprint of what Jesus says here. See, maybe not in the good that our culture thinks of, but good in a different way. See, good because I know I don't have to worry or be anxious about the things going in my life, because I know God has got it in His hands, and He's bigger than all the things that I could worry about. Good because I know my treasures shouldn't be here on earth. So I don't need to constantly be chasing the newest and greatest thing to keep up with the Joneses next door. Right? Because because our treasures are not supposed to be here on earth. Good because I know how to pray, and I know that I can pray to God and that His kingdom would come on earth, which when I pray those things, I'm realizing that it's not about my kingdom here on earth. Which, man, does that relieve some pressure on me? Because it's not about me then at the end of the day. What a relief that would be to truly take in those words. They're wonderful words and teachings of Jesus. But for how many of us does it become that treadmill, right? That stationary bike that's a really good idea and you know the benefits of it, but it slowly gets tucked farther and farther away from you and gathers dust in the basement. It's great. Right? It's very useful, but if we don't feel like using it, what does it actually do for our lives? I want to end today with one more thought, and that's coming from the Gospel of Luke. We've been in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's one of the disciples. Luke is another disciple that gives a different perspective on the teachings of Jesus. And Luke also has a section that talks about the wise and foolish builder. And it's very similar language, but there's one thing that sticks out to me that I want to reference today that's helpful. Out of Luke 6, starting at verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on the rock. When a flood came and the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my word and does not put them into practice is like a man who builds their house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and was completely destroyed. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on the rock. A few words that stuck out to me in that. Dug down deep. Right, they're interesting words there. When I was a kid, I loved digging holes. And me and the girls were even outside for a little bit yesterday, and they wanted their shovels. And it's fun to dig for a little bit, right? Like just dig little holes all over the place. But there comes a point where digging is not fun anymore. And it's about the point where you get to the digging deep, right? All of a sudden, that's when it starts getting dirty. That's when it starts getting hard because you've got to get into the hole. And all of a sudden, it is way more work to get the dirt from the hole and out because in order to dig deeper, you got to dig wider. So it creates so much more work. And I think I love in this version of Luke and the way he says it, you've got to dig deep. Right? To have a relationship like this, to live in the way that Jesus is speaking about, you have to dig deep. It's going to take work. It is going to be messy. But by doing those things, you are laying a foundation on a rock that cannot be shaken. Jesus says, dig down deep, get to your roots, lay on that foundation, that rock, that gospel of God that cannot be shaken. The question I want to leave you with today as we wrap up this series is, are you done putting your foundation on things that change? Right? The things that this culture values, the things that we hear from our friends, that we see on social media that we should be putting our values and our steadfastness on. Are we done doing that? And are we ready to dig down deep? Even though it may be hard, even though it may get messy, and do what it takes to build a foundation on the rock that we know is not going to move. The question is yours. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you again for today. And I thank you for your words and this sermon of Jesus that really can speak to our lives. God, I ask that we take these words and we don't just tuck them back for good knowledge for another day, but we start implementing these things in our lives. We ask for the courage to do that in a world that acts so differently. God, help us get through the dirt of it. Help us get through the dirtiness and the heartache and the hard shovelfuls it takes to get to a firm foundation. And help us lay that. Keep us committed to doing the things you've called us to do. We ask this all in your name we pray. Amen.